Well, good afternoon. My name is Sam Pardue. I have the privilege of being the Dean of the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences here at the University of Georgia. And we are certainly excited that you are here, as well as some of your colleagues and friends that are in another room here in this complex. Excited about the fact that we have a guest speaker here today that many of you obviously know. I want you to think a little bit about food, how important that is in our lives, about every celebration, every major event in your life somehow involves food, whether those are holidays, celebrating the birth of a child. It is ingrained in us. And who we sit down at the table with says a lot of who is in our circle of friends. So food is at our very core, and I'm grateful that the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences gets to play a role in producing the food that we eat. So today it is my great pleasure, and Dan, I'm going to cut your introduction really short. Co-owner and chef at Blue Hill, star of the first season of Netflix's Chef's Table. Would you please welcome Dan Barber?
Cheers, thank you. So I'll start with hawking our new company here, Row 7. We started a seed company 2 weeks ago. Good way to do some product placement here. That's just to explain, we came down here to talk to a group of breeders that Sam introduced us to this morning and meet some farmers. We started the company, we formalized really some relationships that I'd been establishing over the years with some breeders that I just got very excited about talking to. And I didn't know you could talk to a breeder. That really happened by chance. I want to take you through the origin story of the company. But the premise actually has become clearer to me as I've been down here. And I said we formalized the relationship. We really we launched the company. I say we, Charlotte Douglas here running the company, and Kate Barney, who worked at Stone Barns with me for a while, has joined the company. And Myra just joined the company yesterday. So welcome, Myra. So we're a growing company. And like I said, I started this just with the idea of being selfish for me, for flavors, for stuff that I wanted to work with in the kitchen. But what's become clear to me just in the last 24 hours is the necessity of a company like this. I say that just because, as a backdrop to all of this, most of the way seeds are bred, developed, thought about in the world, but in the United States especially, they're done in this way that a breeder once described to me in a statistical analysis. That's to say that a company has an idea for a seed and they put it out in 10,000 locations. And they do a literal statistical analysis on how does it perform. Now, statistical analysis, I guess, goes against the biological analysis, which is what I imagine most of us in this room are most interested in. But statistics say, well, at what largest swath does that seed perform well on? And the ones that do, or the one that does, percentage-wise, graduates to ultimately become a seed. And what this company is doing, and really I say that more by accident because this wasn't any kind of conscious plan, it's to do the exact opposite. It's the pond, the stone in the pond ripple thing that a breeder said to me. And again, I'm getting more clarity about what our company is about as we quickly get older in this business. Now I'm just saying we're just a couple weeks, but I feel older because we've been through a lot here. But the idea is to look at the development of a seed, of a flavor, from the even microscopic in relationship to what most companies, how they look at it. What is it that this particular region, this ecological condition, the cultural conditions, what is it dictating for a seed? And the way we've thought about doing this is partnering the conception of that seed, the breeder, with a chef. Because why shouldn't a chef be at the table with the with the initial construction of the seed. So that comes with a little bit of hubris, but I've learned that it's actually possible, and to do that in the local, hyper local way. And then we're going to see what happens. We actually don't really know. We launched a company with 7 varieties of stuff that we've been working on for a bunch of years, and actually we put it in the hands of some farmers, some of which are here today, to see how those varieties perform here and all the way to the West Coast and Pacific Northwest and South. And we're going to do our own sort of analysis. But we're going to start the breeding projects moving forward on this very local micro level. And why I say I become more emboldened with this idea by being here in Georgia, just in the last couple of hours, seeing the interest and the enthusiasm, the passion from a new food culture, really the youth that is dialed into good food, good flavor, fresh ingredients, and exploring, celebrating this incredibly diverse and an amazing environment that you all have here and history. So it makes more sense to me. But I wanted to tell you that really it started, and if I think of an origin story, I always go back to this moment when we were about second week in August and anticipating tomatoes up where I am. Tomatoes are at their height in August. You really wait the whole year for like 3 weeks, right? And we had a great tomato harvest on the horizon this summer in 2009, I think it was. And then all of a sudden we were hit with a late blight disease that was historic. And if you know anything about late blight, it happens really quickly. And this one in particular was very devastating. So a field of tomatoes that like turned to this in a couple of days. And that was a pretty depressing scene to go out to. 2 weeks before I went out to this like Garden of Eden of tomatoes, and then come out a couple of days later and you're destroyed. And I was walking with the farm manager, Jack Algier, from the Stone Barn Center where our restaurant is attached to. And we were exploring this Chernobyl-like scene. And then out of the corner of my eye, I checked out this like tiny little patch of really ripe, beautiful tomatoes. And Jack brought me over to them and he said, this is an experiment from Cornell University, our land-grant university in New York, that has been bred and selected for resistance to late blight, to this disease. And they were stunning. So I brought them back into the kitchen, and in all my elitism and haughtiness, totally dismissed them before I cut into them because they looked actually as perfect as they look here. And as a chef, or as just anyone who loves food, you're trained, I think, very quickly to recognize that something that looks too perfect, especially a tomato, is probably not going to deliver on much flavor. That's why we look for the heirlooms of those lumps and bumps and the stuff that we associate with ruggedness, but also with depth of flavor and sweetness. And anyway, we cut into it, and we just like totally wrong, me and the sous chefs and the cooks who are around us. Really delicious, like super sweet, but also has a balance of acidity that even some heirlooms don't deliver on, and we just were completely blown away. And what I realized at that moment was that I had done what I always do, which is like look at things in black and white, and that when it came to the seed level, I had been proselytizing for old heirlooms. Well, now my old heirlooms were all dead in 48 hours. But I had thought that the other side of that equation was, the Monsanto maniacs that I didn't want any part of, if for no other reason than they never produced anything really delicious to eat. And that's kind of where my head was set. And then just in one little taste of a modern tomato, I realized that I had it all wrong. That there's this huge in between where you can take advantage of the past with respect and modernity and turn it into something very exciting for the future. So this tomato is now released, and there are other tomatoes in the works that are resistant to this fungal disease. So that's sort of the first story that came out. I got my my mind set on a different course with seeds. And the second story that kind of comes out of this, I guess, is meeting this man, Michael Mazurek, who is now a partner in Row 7 Seeds. And Michael was invited down for a dinner with a bunch of breeders from Cornell that I cooked for at the restaurant till quite late at night. And I went out to the table to say hello. And this guy, Michael, just zoomed in on some quick questions. And like, you just got, when you're in the presence of someone, you're like, wow, this guy's very special. And I was thinking that because I thought he was a chef too, because he really, you see, I'm complimenting myself here because I'm so inquisitive. And so Michael was really just was thinking about, what was it that I was looking for in these certain flavors in the meal. I don't remember exactly what he was asking, but it was pretty cerebral. So I brought him back to the kitchen just to chat with him a little bit more. And one of the cooks was prepping butternut squash, just the regular workaday squash. This is now going back about 9 years. And I said to him just off the cuff and kind of joking around, if you're such a great breeder, and Michael is a squash breeder, if you're such a great squash breeder, why don't you actually make a butternut squash that tastes good? Because butternut squash, we go through these heroics to make butternut squash sing, like we add honey or maple syrup, or we caramelize it to caramelize the sugars, or roast it for a long time to expel the water and really get some flavor out of this dog. And and he looked at me, and this definitely won't ever forget. He looked at me and he said, in all my years of breeding, no one has ever asked me to select for flavor. And that's when the lights went out and the curtain went down, and just said, first of all, who the hell is he talking to? And secondly, why aren't I talking to him? Because that's all I care about. And that did start a conversation with him that now resulted in Row 7 and many years of collaboration with this really brilliant breeder, and an introduction to a whole host of brilliant breeders, of which I met another generation of this morning that Sam put together. But what I realize is that breeders are talking to people. They're talking to the kind of people that I just don't have a lot of interest in, because these are this is the big food chain, and the big food chain is not looking for the things that I'm looking for, and I'm zoned in on flavor. And what I learned from Michael and all these other breeders is that when you're selecting for other characteristics, you are by definition making a compromise. You're selecting against flavor. And when you're selecting against flavor, of course, we all know we're selecting against nutrition, because flavor and nutrition are the one and the same thing. You cannot have a delicious squash without a whole ton of nutrition as part and parcel of the package. That's a nice correspondence, and I thought that was worthy of chefs being at the table. Also, for no other reason that chefs curate flavors every night. Well, why aren't we at the table talking to breeders? And when you think about breeders as architects, then seeds are really the blueprint for the whole system. If the farmer, and I know a lot of great farmers up north, and I met a lot today, but if the farmer is expected to derive flavors and aesthetics from the kind of produce that I want, in some ways, the seed is really determining that. The cake is already baked by the time it's in the hands of the farmer. And so I realized that in all my obsession with farm to table, I needed to dial back maybe a little bit further. Now I'm not going to interrupt this and ask you for a little water. Oh, it's right here. Okay, thank you. Sorry, my throat is getting choked up thinking about my my new varieties of vegetables. So I wanted to take you through a couple of examples of these vegetables that I've been so fortunate enough to have this conversation with these breeders and get into action. One of the earliest ones was an off-the-cuff conversation I had with a breeder on the telephone named Erwin Goldman. Erwin is a brilliant beet breeder in the Midwest and Wisconsin. And I was in the middle of January, February, many years ago, and frustrated because we have tons of cold storage crops of beets, a couple thousand pounds. Back then, we used to get tickets in the kitchen from the waiters that gave people's preferences, their allergies, no gluten, obviously, and all that stuff. but most people were talking about no beets because the waiters were giving a warning that the meal at this time of year definitely has several courses with beets, and people's reaction was like, I don't eat beets. And I just had a frustration. I was on the phone with him and saying, this is frustrating and kind of untenable for me. And he said, I've been thinking about a beet that actually I think you might be really interested in. I've identified the compound that people are reacting to. It's called geosmin. It's a cluster of compounds that give you that really earthy flavor of beets. And for some people, really earthy flavor of beet is something very desirable. For most people, it's too strong and it's off-putting, and especially for kids that kind of have that experience of choking down beets because their parents tell us to eat beets. And he said, I've been working on this project of selecting against geosmin. Selecting against geosmin. Yeah, that sounds great. And so that began a relationship with Irwin where he would send graduate students to Blue Hill with, we paid for gas and tolls and a trunk full of beet selections, and we were choosing them. And the ones that we chose, you can go and replant half the beet, cut off half the beet, you roast it, and the other half you stick back in the ground. It's a very efficient way to do the breeding. It was really fun. And we ended up with what was called the Badger Flame beet, which is so low in geosmin, we serve it raw at the restaurant as a carpaccio, just with a little bit of salt and olive oil, maybe a little bit of lemon juice. But cooking it almost is a travesty because it's a gateway drug into beets. If you don't like beets, this is your baby. And then there's a great breeder at Cornell named Walter DeJong, and Walter is a very serious potato chip breeder. He's one of the chippers, the leading chippers in the country. You know that term, chippers, yeah. I mean, that's an ag school term, but he's in the Northeast. He's one of the more famous ones. And anyway, he had sort of this secret, back then it was sort of a secret project of getting more into table potatoes. He was frustrated. He basically wants to erase the russet potato from the earth. Thinks it's a sham, and that the reason we're adding tons of butter and creme fraiche and bacon bits and all that stuff is sour cream is because potato doesn't taste like anything. And he's right. He's right. And so he's worked on breeding a couple different varieties that are so buttery, so creamy, so unctuous that you dare not put any butter, just some salt. And he did it, and that's one of the ones that we released for row 7. It was a trial number 150 for a long time, and now he named it Upstate Abundance. And I think that's probably key here because the potato is so abundant that here's an example where flavor and yield just are not at odds with each other at all. And he also, I thought, very lovingly gave a nod to upstate farmers in New York because farmers down by me get all the attention and all the media coverage. And another one of his frustrations, Walter has some frustrations. I'm listing his frustrations, but the other one is that these upstate farmers who produce a lot of the commodity crops just don't get a nod to their expertise and their production. And so he named it Upstate Abundance, and we're going with that. And I think it's a really exciting potato for the future, as are these projects with corn that we're working on. Another breeder from Wisconsin who shares this frustration that I have, and I bet if there are other, I know there are some other chefs in the room, but these chefs also share this frustration of the sweet corns being so super sweet that all you're tasting really is sugar. I mean, I see a lot of heads nodding. That's, in some respects, corn breeding has been too successful to go from starchiness to sweet and overwhelming starchiness to overwhelming sugar, so that you absolutely are eating a sugar pellet and have very little understanding about 3 seconds after you swallow that you've actually eaten corn. And that's not really, I mean, that's a nice hit of sugar, of course, but you could just eat sugar. And so in meeting this plant breeder, I also learned the history of sweet corn, which is quite young. It's a couple hundred years old. It's a mutation sweet corn that has been selected off this mutation. It happened up near where I am, so it's actually one of our few indigenous local crops. And our goal for this is to bring sweet corn back to what he calls dessert corn, but not to the super sweet stuff, to stuff which first and foremost tastes like corn, and that when you taste it, you taste differences in the corn, different kinds of nuttiness and different kinds of starches and different kinds of sugars that add to the experience of actually eating corn. So that's one of the ones that are in the works. And then dialing back now to one of the first projects that I worked on was also a little bit by accident with a guy named Steve Jones, who's at Washington State University. And I came by Steve Jones because I was back in the heirloom phase of my youth and proselytizing about those heirlooms. And I was in the midst of writing a book, and I had stumbled upon this variety of wheat called Eragon III in Spain that really makes a fantastic bread wheat. And so I had heard about Steve Jones, quite a well-known wheat breeder, and very iconoclastic. And I'm looking for characters in the book, and just called him up out of the blue, and I got this variety that is actually going extinct. I mean, Eragon III, there's one farmer left, one family farm that's growing Eragon III, and it's quite threatened. And I told him this whole sort of sob story, and he just kind of laughed and said, yeah, I'll get you Eragon III, and I'll grow it out for you, which is what I wanted. I wanted it grown here in the United States, and then I wanted an updated version for me on the East Coast. But he said, I could just take Eragon III and make it better. And I thought, for a wheat that's several hundred years old and really celebrated, that this was such a haughty, arrogant thing to be saying to me, that it's like he's going to make a great character. And you do writing, you understand it's a lot easier to write about characters that are iconoclastic and have some passionate things to say. Yes?
It's difficult to hear you back.
I'm sorry. Should I start over? What? I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't. I'm glad you raised your hand. I thought you were going to have something to say about Eragon III, and I was so scared that you were. Anyway, I'm sorry that I don't know how much of this you missed, but I was talking about a wheat that I was really interested in saving and preserving and telling the story of the preservation of wheat. And I called a wheat breeder who has quite an attitude, and he basically said, instead of saving it, I'm going to make it better for you if that's of interest to you. And it immediately became of interest because I wanted to write about his failed attempts to make a beautiful wheat better. And he proved me quite wrong. And what I learned in the process was that all of the wheat that is bred, that he and the wheat breeders around the country are breeding, is for this stuff, for the white flour, and that it's feeding into the kind of system. When I talk about a blueprint and the kind of architecture for how a farm is used, we could not be a better example, because we aren't eating the bran, we aren't eating the endosperm, we're only eating the endosperm, and the breeding imperative is to get to the endosperm, and that's been that way for a long time. And so what I was asking for was a type of wheat in Eragon III that had been preserved for long enough that it was a whole wheat bread, that you were meant to eat it as whole wheat bread, which makes the bran sweeter, possibly thinner, and infinitely more delicious for whole wheat bread, if that's your goal. And that was my goal, whole wheat bread. And it was also not to mix wheats. I wanted to advertise the beauty of this wheat Eragon III. And ultimately, as I learned through Steve, I could advertise the beauty of thousands of different wheats that were localized to me, which is how wheat used to be celebrated in this country not that long ago. But you have to be committed to 100% whole wheat. And the breeding directive has been towards this stuff, towards a monoculture of white flour. And so that has bred against the bran and bred a bitter bran, so that when you go and use modern wheats for whole wheat bread, well, it's not that delicious. It's pretty bitter, and which is why most bakers, when they make a whole wheat bread, mix in about 30% bran, and it's about 70% white flour. They call it whole wheat bread, but it's not whole wheat. And it's definitely not one variety of wheat to advertise that particular flavor. So that's the project we went about. Steve Jones took this Eragon III variety and married it, actually kind of menage a trois with a couple different varieties, and got to a new wheat, which we called Barber wheat. He did it through just some old world breeding techniques, but utilizing modern opportunities for technology, like the wheat is genome mapped, and he could do this kind of work very quickly. This is not genetic engineering in the sense of transgenic, in the sense of GMO. It's very old school, just speed it up. And so we went from a 0 to 60 in a couple of years, about 3 or 4 years. And here we are testing my new baby in the field, kind of like competitive summer camp or something. And it happened to do really well. I was talking to a group of breeders this morning. I said that Barber wheat in these test plots harvested 156 bushels an acre, albeit this is a tester and actually in some ways not really fair to say, but I was so proud of it, I'm going to tell you anyway. The 156 bushels an acre, where the average wheat harvest in, say, Kansas is something like 40 bushels an acre. And also produced, sorry, I skipped ahead, also produced like this amazing wheat, which we now work with as a stable seed in our kitchen and bake an amazing loaf of bread off of 100% Barber wheat, which again has the parent of Eragon III and a couple other parents, but preserve the character of Eragon III and actually did what Steve said it would do and make it better. And to me, it was an example of what's possible, not just in the pursuit of whole wheat bread, but in the pursuit of changing a food system that produces wheat like that. I want to open this up to more of a conversation, so I feel very professorial and lecturing, but I want to tell you just what happened to the squash, the little joke I said about why don't you breed a butternut squash that actually tastes good. And Michael Mazurek took me up on that challenge, and we worked for several years on trialing a shrunken butternut squash. In part, it has less water, and in large part, it has a heck of a lot more flavor, and it arrived at this squash on the right is called the honey nut squash. That was released just a couple years ago. Are you okay hearing me now? Is that better? So I thought I would, just for the interest of giving you an example, because I know in the back of many of your minds is what I have been often asked, which is your ideas about these boutique vegetables. They're going to stay in the cathedral of your white tablecloth restaurant. They're not going to go anywhere. They're elitist, et cetera, et cetera. So may I get ahead of that comment and that question by painting a picture of what happened here. And that started, again, with my restaurant kitchen and the farm, Stone Barn Center, which is the normal farm-to-table equation that we now know a lot about and celebrate quite a bit. But it introduced a breeder into the equation. And what ended up happening was again, in the same way that I said to Steve Jones, I want 100% whole wheat bread, and I don't want to make any compromises on that. This was the same sort of challenge. We want a squash that is jaw-droppingly delicious, and that was the goal. And I'm going to speed up here in the interest of time, but Michael Mazurek created this several years later and introduced it to a small bespoke seed company, sort of like what we're introducing with Row 7. And it did not go anywhere. It sat in the catalog as a shrunken butternut squash called the honey nut. And it really didn't move because no one knew what a shrunken butternut squash was. And about that time, I started talking about it a lot because I got very excited about our little butternut squash because it was so delicious. We served a ton of it in the restaurant, obviously, but then we did some conferences and talked about it with a bunch of different chefs who got very excited about it very quickly, again, because it's hard not to because it's so delicious. And that led to a farmer or two at the farmers market in New York City who wanted to take it on because chefs were asking them to take it on. And that led very quickly to other seed companies wanting to sell it because all of a sudden a demand was coming on, which led to some distribution into the bigger food chain, which led to Trader Joe's, which is a national. You have Trader Joe's out here in Atlanta? Yeah. And then Blue Apron. Blue Apron harvested this past year. I'm fast forwarding through all this, but this past year they harvested 1.9 million acres of it. Yeah. And it's been now reviewed in all the major publications, not as as squash and recipes for squash, but as particular honey nut, which suggests that it is now available nationwide at most good farmers markets for sure, and increasingly supermarkets. A baby food company called Michael Mazurek and said, "We hear you have a squash that actually tastes good, and we've been getting a lot of complaints from mothers about the taste of our product, and we were wondering if we could use this for our baby food." And they tried it, and because of the industrial machinery that they used to make the puree for the baby food, it crushed the squash. The squash's skin was too thin. for the machinery. And they said, no, sorry, we can't use it. And Michael came back with a tweak on the variety to harden the skin, to create yet a new variety for more industrial production. Same kind of flavor, but just an adaptation for the desired intent. That didn't take long either, and we're hoping that this is going to go into production very soon. And then there was a seed oil company up near Michael who heard about now a lot of this squash going into production. Well, what about doing squash seed for an oil? And they're now going into production with that, with the intent of erasing olive oil from our cabinets with a local oil from the squash. So all of a sudden it became quite complicated, the picture. And it was, just want to remind everyone, it was based on a very, in my mind at that point, very stupid question. If you're such a great breeder, why don't you make the thing taste good? And because of the laser focus, and he was exactly right when he said no one's asked that, and it's our job to ask for it. I also want to say two other things about the squash, because I know this too comes up quite a bit when I talk about the squash. Well, it's become popular because it tastes good, but is it so expensive, et cetera, and is this really for the masses? There's two things I want to make sure I underscore with that. One is that Michael inserted or selected for a ripeness indicator in the honey nut squash. So apparently, I learned this very late in the game, that butternut squash turns ripe color before it's actually ripe. So it's quite green, even though it looks ripe, and it is almost always picked green in the field. And it ripens in storage and then is delivered to us to eat. The honey nut, to guarantee the flavor that I was challenging him with, he put the ripeness indicator so the farmer knows not to pick the squash when it's green and waits until it's vine ripened on the vine. So all the nutrients, all the flavor is there, and it's a guarantee, because you don't see honey nuts that are green because that doesn't look like a ripe squash. And that's protected the integrity of this nifty little invention. It also ensures a kind of nutrient density that is not possible from green squash, from unripened squash. And so all of a sudden you have the nutrients doubling for no other reason than we are eating a ripe squash, period. That's a little bit of a change of culture, which gets back to the wheat, because I'm drawn to wheat only, again, because of this idea of how much of it we eat in this country. And if we are looking for an alternate food system to what we have developed over the last 50 years, starting with wheat would be a good place to start, because we eat a lot of wheat. And one of the questions that we may start with is flavor. Is what do we want from our wheat? We want a whole wheat. I want a whole wheat that sings as a whole wheat. And what it changed in the calculus was not just a slice of bread. It looks to change the whole system, how it's done from the seed all the way to the oven. And that, when I talk about the architecture of this, I do see the possibilities of this starting with the intent. The conversation with the person who's curating the taste, and why I believe chefs need to get so involved with this. We have a great group of chefs, local chefs right here in the front row, who are doing just that already here. And our job, it seems to me, is to move beyond that and demand more. And that's why we started the company. And I think I'll just turn that over to some conversation now and go from there. Thank you very much.
If you've got questions, you would just please stand.
We just planted all of your seeds.
Oh, thank you.
University of Georgia.
Can you hear that up there?
All of the seeds we just planted this week, including the potatoes. So let's know how
Thank
that
you.
goes. We have 400 varieties of heirlooms, and we're working with the chefs so that they can tell us what they want to have grown.
Fantastic.
So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Thank you very much. That is my aunt, just so you know. Yes.
I was wondering how those varieties hold up under the
Yeah, so I'll just talk broadly about the intent. And the intent is that while I'm hyper-focused on the flavor, the release of these varieties don't happen unless the disease resistance is very good, very strong. This is organically produced seed. So we have a bent towards organics. I have a bent towards organics because I think the flavor is the best from organic agriculture, forgetting about all the other attendant issues. But for me, I'm headed to organic because that's where the juice is, for me to look like a better chef. And so I recognize, and that's why Michael is a 50% partner and the breeders are 50% partners in this. If you're looking at a Venn diagram, it's where the height of flavor and the height of productivity, yield too, yield and disease resistance meet. And that's where we release the seed. If it is jaw-droppingly delicious but doesn't have the yield or the disease resistance, we're not interested, actually, in the end. As heartbreaking as that is to say, it's the truth. Because the goal, again, is to have that flavor but get it outside of my cathedral and into the larger food culture. And without the yield, that doesn't happen. And that to me is the lesson of the honey nut as well, is that the yield, the flavor was so good and it's a ripe squash, so all of a sudden the culture of eating squash is really going to change. I mean, I think if I'm standing here, if I have a chance to speak in 10 years here, we will see the shrunken butternut as the standard. It has to be, because you're not going to go back to the stuff that doesn't taste good. The price is a little bit more expensive, it's true, but give us 10 years of breeding, and Monsanto guy was on a panel with me, and he was saying we've spent $1 million a day on corn research, $1 million a day. That's 365 days a week. And so what did we spend on this? I don't, this was, the beauty of the land grant university is that that's what they're there for. And that's where our tax dollars go. So it's essentially a free system. We just have to have the wherewithal and the knowledge to ask. And so I'm asking for the flavor, and are you a farmer? You're asking for the disease resistance and the yield so that you can be incentivized to grow it. And that's a fair question. And we want to meet you halfway. Yeah. Hello.
Somebody at home trying to do this in their backyard, cooking and gardening, what do you suggest is the biggest fruits that you can grow to see that change from mass seed to something more fruitful?
What's the lever that the backyard grower is?
What produce do you see the biggest change?
Oh, if you wanted to plant varieties.
Tomatoes, fruit, vegetables.
Oh my God. Well, you got to go to the row 7 site first. How many acres do you have? Yeah, that's okay, man. We'll take you. No, I tend to still go towards the older varieties. And for a backyard gardener, I don't think there's a problem with that. There's something to be said for both getting to know why these old varieties have lasted, why have they been handed down, why have they been treated with such respect. The fact that the yield is no good is really not or the yield or the agronomics, the responsiveness to a hard rainfall at the wrong time isn't good. It doesn't really make a difference, right? You're in a backyard garden, you're having fun, and you're celebrating what's possible. So I like I said, row 7 first, and then anywhere else you want to go on the older varieties. There are some great new varieties. There's some great seed catalogs out there. I'm not gonna promote anyone else up here, but there's some people doing some great work identifying great varieties, and some of them are quite new and good. Our position here about this is that we want chefs to be the advertisement for these new flavors or these enhanced flavors. Because again, they do curate this stuff, and they should be advertising that. So, yeah.
Just out of curiosity, I'm a clinical research nurse here at the University of Georgia. One of the things we do is program in South Georgia do fresh fruits and vegetables that benefit farmers, but also benefit health. Have you done anything as far as studying the impact on health?
We are. We're in the process of studying that, but there's a ton of variables, and it's very expensive to do. But we plan to do it in a more exhaustive way. What I have unscientifically understood is the relationship between why I'm so excited about a particular vegetable and its flavor and its nutrient density, that these are very compatible ideas, and that, like I said, you cannot have that great flavor without that flavonoids, without that flavor. And so exploring that and improving it in a way that makes people more convinced than my just saying it is what we would like to do as we move forward. Yeah. Yes?
You do this on your own farm, but is row 7 going to get into what you're feeding livestock and how that affects flavor of, say, chicken or pork or something?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think if there's a North Star here for it, it's that we look at this as a whole system. And so I would like to see a seed company that talks about creating a blueprint for a region that is responsive to the environment and plants a whole suite of crops that give a fertility that gets us to sing in the flavor of beets like this. So what are those lowly crops? And do those lowly crops also become feed crops for animals? And do you think about the system really in the way that organic was meant, which is like an organism? It's like the whole gestalt. And that, you know, we as chefs tend to concentrate on these things that we can shop at the farmer's market and use it sort of like a supermarket shelf, you know, and we like this and this and this, and we call ourselves, you know, sustainable and farm to table. But is that really a system? No, it's a shopping list is what it is. It's a better shopping list than, you know, a supermarket in many ways, I guess. But it's not holier than now in the long-term viability and resiliency of a region. And so as a chef, I'm very interested in this orchestration of what are these patterns in the agricultural landscape that we can promote and mimic on our menu. You know, how can we do that? What I'm actually saying is cuisine. I mean, that's what the history of cooking is. It's derived from what the land is telling you can grow, and then a brilliant group of peasants in all these different environments figured out a way to promote what the land could grow and eke out the nutrition and the flavors, and developed a pattern of eating where the culture celebrated that, if for no other reason, because that's what they could eat, and that supported a landscape. And in America, we just have never been forced into that kind of negotiation. We've always been so rich. And so rich in that you throw a seed in the ground and it you know, it grows. And we're a young country and we have tons of fertility. And we came over here and there was rainfall, and all of a sudden we could move west and tear up virgin land. And so just been soaked in abundance. And part of the lack of food culture we have today, I really think is zeroes right in on that. We were just never forced into creativity, both in rotations in the way that most cultures were because of exhausted soils, but we were never forced into the creativity in the kitchen, in the gastronomy, in the transmutation of these lowly crops or lowly cuts of meat into something that really becomes celebrated. And that is the ticket to sustainability, because that's the thing that lasts thousands of years. And if there is a way to create a seed company that introduces this idea, and of course this is part of the maturation, so much the long game, but if there's a way to think about that is both for feed livestock, for cover crop, for human consumption, for alcohol, you know, for barley, for beer, etc., you then have a mature food system. And I think it needs to start with the seeds, because if the intent isn't for the kinds of things that I've just talked about that fill out the health of the landscape, then you're really picking and choosing. And I like this whole web of relationships. So that's where we're going with this. But we're starting with 7 seeds. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great that you're maximizing the breeding technology for improving your ingredients in your kitchen. However, there are these criticisms about our sense of taste, or us being desensitized already because of the hypersensory experiences we get because of modernity. That's a social kind of scientist criticism. So we're losing our sense of taste basically because of all this different explosion of flavors. Some people have already looked at artificial flavors. I'm not so sure with plants. So I'm wondering how you're navigating the tension between the two. I mean, there's this great side of the world of flavor from the breeding side, and then there's this
the fake stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. The question was the tension between, well, you're introducing a new, I have so many tensions that I've now added on another tension I didn't know was a tension. But the new tension in my life is between the scientists who are creating flavors that are from chemically derived, and from these breeders who are doing it naturally. And I think the question is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the question is, how do you compete with that long term? First of all, you're suggesting that there's a lost generation here, and that we are hooked on kind of flavors that are focused and bright. It's mostly what you're talking about is sugar, and how do you get away from that? And to me, and part of the reason that I'm a part of the Stone Barn Center for Food Agriculture is getting to kids, because getting to kids early and involving them not just in taste but in the agriculture part of it, in the food production part of it, is a way to inculcate a kind of not just ethic but a taste sensory experience that is complex and very tough to beat. So in that sense, starting early is a big one. But I also have a lot of faith in the power of real flavors. I don't know that food companies in this kind of nefarious, we're going down a very dystopian, nefarious kind of, there's a group of people who are trying to wean us out of like real stuff. I don't know that it's that stark. As I said, I'm trying not to be so black and white as I get older. But I have a lot of faith in the idea of real flavors sparking a kind of enthusiasm and passion and excitement and happiness that is impossible to ignore. That's what I've seen, and I'm banking on it literally with this new company. Yeah. Yes.
You said that you're looking at the microscopic differences in the seeds. What sort of things are you looking for? And did you notice any differences between the seeds before these compounds get time to develop?
But before what?
Before the compounds have time to develop in the plant, did you notice any microscopic differences in the seeds?
In terms of before they become fruit, before we're tasting them, what are we noticing in the field? In the different varietals when we're testing it, just be a little more specific, because I.
Yeah, so between the conventional vegetables and the
Oh.
vegetables that you're working with, what are the microscopic differences? You said you wanted to look at that. I was just wondering if you had gotten into that to see the difference between like the butternut and the honey nut.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of when it comes in my kitchen, is that what you're saying, or out in the field?
You said earlier that you wanted to look at the microscopic.
No, what I'm focused on is this idea that a seed company is not looking for a micro region. It's not interested in the micro region for the most part. That's excusing a lot of small seed companies that have blossomed over the years, so I'm conveniently removing them from this. I'm saying the thrust of where most of the future of our vegetables coming from is from a interest in a statistical analysis of how these seeds do in multiple locations, and taking the ones that do best in the most locations. And so what I see in that is what you taste when you get a vegetable that's sort of dumbed down. Most carrots that are grown in this country are grown in sand. They've been selected for that. They've been grown for very fast growth. They're big carrots that end up really tasting not a lot like carrots. And so my biggest takeaway from the work that we're doing is the kind of flavor that you're experiencing is the best analogy I can make is to like drinking a wine or a well-made beer. Is like you finish your sip and you're sitting there, talking, and like 2 minutes later you realize you're still tasting what you just tasted. Like that's a kind of permanence that comes from a well-constructed wine or a well-constructed beer and a well-constructed vegetable. And that, to me, that's the essence. These can be very subtle differences, but actually quite profound if you look at it over the course of a diet. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes. A farmer in the room, so I'm glad you're. Yeah. Can you just talk about your farm for a second? Where you're farming and.
Sure. I take care of a small certified organic farm in the metro area of Atlanta called Love is Love Farm at Gaia Gardens. We grow a diversity of vegetable crops. We've got other farmer friends in the room. And I lease the small property that I own from a group of 67 homeowners that have committed to preserving the land as a working organic.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Great.
Yeah, it's a real great opportunity. Thanks for bringing your vision and good work with us here in Georgia. So like I said, I'm a certified organic farmer, really excited to grow out your seeds this year. Like you, and I'm also a member of the board of Georgia Organics
Yeah.
here in the state. Like you, I share a passion for organic certification and organic farmers. I think they're a hallmark of higher premiums for farmers, stronger farm systems. They all lead to increased farmer prosperity,
Yeah.
which as a young farmer is really important for me and like thinking about the outlook of farming for the rest
Yeah.
of my career. What work do you think we can do to encourage chefs and restaurants to see certified organic as an integral part of sourcing locally?
I think, do you get the question back there? I'll just repeat it. It's how do you get chefs in particular, and probably the larger food culture ultimately, how do you get them to appreciate, and one way to say appreciate is pay a little bit more for what goes into producing on a healthy organic farm? Is that a fair way to say it? And it's a great question, and it's the core of the work that we're doing at the restaurant, which is celebrating and advertising what you are hoping more people will advertise through flavor, through the currency of pleasure and delight, because it is one thing that Americans do very well is greediness. And when we're greedy for what is truly delicious, we do go out of our way to experience that. Something that's pleasurable is something that we as Americans negotiate quite well. So I always go back to the and I try not to talk about the benefits of organic agriculture on our environment and all the other problems that are associated with bad farming, and look to the benefits of the pleasure. But you have an opportunity through this connection with chefs that I think is pretty singular. It's in that conversation. That's what's launched the farm to table movement. And let's not skip over the fact that the farm to table movement has done unbelievable things. The fact that I'm talking to you here is testament to that. But this movement has grown in ways that no one could have imagined 15 years ago, forgetting about 30 years ago. And what's happening is it's penetrating the mainstream food culture in ways that make the supermarket or the big food chain or agribusiness look a little bit like melting icebergs. They're becoming irrelevant rapidly. And what I think your question, just to turn it a little bit on its head, is to say it's working, and that people are willing to pay more. Whether they're willing to pay more because they care about the health of the environment, they don't want to be eating pesticides, or they just want to be eating more delicious food. That is happening, and it's bleeding into the culture in ways that are pretty profound for what I'm interested in is maybe the second part of your question, and the one that's more complex. It goes back to what we were just talking about here with what do you require to grow in an organic way that really fulfills a healthy landscape? What are all those cover crops? What are all those rotation crops? What kind of diversity for your environment is required to make a healthy foodscape? And if as a chef we are interested in the carrots, well, what is it that was rotated before the carrots? What are the between crops? Those are all the deepening of the farm to table connection, the deepening of the conversation that I think is the next wave here, and what I'd like the Row 7 company to mature into is that deepening of the conversation, the complexity of it. Because it's about eating diversity, it's about supporting the kind of negotiations that you're going through every day that you have to go through. And I just want to finish by saying that is so interesting. That organic farmers are forced into that. That is not a choice. That's a dictate. And when you're a conventional farmer, you are not forced into that. You can opt out of those decisions because you can spray a problem away. For some ecologies, I'm willing and open to hear that that's the only way to do it. And for fruit production, and as I learned this morning, pecan production around here really is the only way to do it. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a whole host of decisions that are intriguing, complex, often fail, are frustrating, but they lead to a kind of soil structure, kind of fertility, and the kind of vegetables that we're talking about here today that I find so fascinating. And I, as a chef, and anybody who really cares about eating, needs to get in that conversation in a deeper way, because that's the true sustainability, is what is it that the land's telling you to go? What are those negotiations that you're doing? How can I help support that? It's not just the tomato and the eggplant and the zucchini in the summer. It's everything else and everything in between. And it's our responsibility to both understand what those imperatives are and to support it. So I just want to say I don't know anything about your farming, and you seem like a great guy. I've known you for 5 minutes. But I really applaud what you're doing, especially down here in this very difficult environment. It's also a blessed environment, but it's a difficult environment, as I've heard about all morning, to grow and grow successfully and grow organically because of the pressure. So I really applaud your work, and thank you for coming here today. I think does that wrap it up for us? Is there anything else?
I think we've got time for one more.
Okay, yeah.
Dan's got to catch an airplane.
Yeah.
I've got a quick question on your Eragon III. Just because I started getting a gluten
Yeah.
sensitive, and I know the newer GM bred flour has 90 chromosomes compared to the old that had 3, and that's why it's hard to digest.
Well, yeah.
Is there a better chromosome level in the Eragon III?
I want to be careful because the breeder Steve Jones, who if he was here would just probably disagree with it because he's disagreeing with everyone on everything. But he doesn't believe that that's the issue, and he's not ready to land on what the issue is. But I'll just suggest that part of the reason that our diners who come to our restaurant and have real gluten sensitivities, and have our bread, have Barber wheat, I've never in the 7 years that we've been serving it, 6 or 7 years we've been serving, I've never had one person complain to me about Barber wheat. I've had a ton of people come back to the restaurant who don't eat bread any other time of the year but eat it when they come to us. And again, that's not scientific or anything, but I think the two reasons are, one is there is something to say for older wheats that have a kind of root system that I'm now saying this only out of anecdotal evidence, that grabs onto minerals and nutrients that add to the flavor and add to the pleasure of eating the bread, and I also think add to the health experience. That would be one. But the second is that the bread that we're making is fermented, so you are soaking the bread literally with water, and you are making bioavailable what is not bioavailable if you never soak whole wheat. So. Or any wheat for that matter. You are making it more digestible by fermenting bread. That's where the sourness comes from. It's also the complexity of flavor, and definitely part of the pleasure of like eating bread, I think, is that format. So part of the reason I think people grab onto Barber wheat from the gluten point of view is because we make the bread in the right way. We take the time to do it. And the time to do it is really fermenting the bread overnight and for 72 hours. It depends on the bread we're doing, but that's a big consideration for digestibility. And again, we do it not for that. We do it because it tastes better. But it's for us, it's ended up being a nice two-pronged approach to. I hope you'll come and have it and prove me right. Thank you all very much for being here this afternoon. Thank you.
We have a gift basket of Georgia-centric products.
Right on.
And, we did grow olives in this state and produce some pretty good olive oil. Because he's going to get on an airplane, we will box it up and ship it to you so you don't have to
thank you.
it through the airport. But let's thank Dan one more time.
Yeah, thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you for that. Is that really for me? I love it. Thank you, man.
Yeah, we'll send it to you. It's just some bulldog stuff.
Did we land on time, or are we late?
One more shot of you two and some
Yeah,
licking.
come on.
Oh, yeah, sure. Just tell me where.
Yeah.
Dan, come see us. I'm doing
Yes.
this to run the trials so that we can create more market farmers